astute, renowned astrophysicist who, for some reason, has injected himself into this conversation. Or maybe he was just asked about it, he gave a horrible answer, and people want to know why he gave that answer, but he's not backing down. And this, I believe, originated on the Trigonometry podcast, where he had this argument where he said, well, maybe we should just, instead of having men and women compete in separate categories, we categorize by hormones. And he said this months ago. And he's still saying it, even though he says he's just making it up as he goes along. Maybe you shouldn't talk about it if you are just going to make it up. I mean, you're not a comedian. You don't have the artistic integrity that us podcasters have. The artistic license, I should say. But he goes on Piers Morgan, and Piers Morgan challenges him on this. And he is still not backing down on his claim that, you know, people should be separated by gender. He's not backing down on his claim that they should be separated perhaps differently by hormone level or something like that instead of gender. He sees the separation of sports by gender as arbitrary, let's say, or as typical as weight classes, which is not. It's completely different, obviously, because, you know, it's hard to even explain his position, but he believes that, you know, men and women should basically be able to compete at the same weight classes, which you will see him say here on Piers Morgan, and he thinks that's an innocuous claim, just as if, you know, as long as the hormone levels, the testosterone levels are matching up, there can be no advantage. So we're going to pick this apart a little bit, and we're going to see what he says. There's some ridiculous things in here. Let's take a listen.
What I see is sports is on the frontier of how to handle this frontier of people who are trans. It's on the frontier of how to resolve that. And I'm making this up now. Imagine the future of sports does not distinguish sex. It distinguishes and sorts people by hormone ratio.
And again, he's not making this up right now. He made this up, arguably, when he actually made it up, was months and months ago. Might have even been as far back as March. I'll give him August because everything gets so mushed together. At least a few months have gone by where he first suggested this.
I'm making this up, but imagine that if that were the case. That would be interesting. You get a hormone test, you're in this range, and then you compete against other people with the same range of hormones.
That's ridiculous.
That's
Neil, that is ridiculous.
No, it's not. I'll tell you why it's not ridiculous.
You're going to give every single person in sport a hormone test.
Hold on. I used to wrestle. And wrestling, there are people who weigh, sorry, I'm using pounds here, 125 pounds, right on up to 240 pounds. They don't wrestle each other. The entire sport separates people so that the contest is interesting.
Yeah.
And so the people of the same weight wrestle each other, and that is the contest.
But if Floyd Mayweather...
I don't know if that's how it will land.
Hang on, Neil. If Floyd Mayweather fought a woman boxer, a female woman boxer, who was the same weight division, he would annihilate her. That's why we don't let it happen. And in fact, in the Paris Olympics, the winner of one of the women's boxing competitions, one of the females who took her on. But my point is that I just think that, if you don't mind me saying, I say this respectfully because I love you, but it just seems to me like you've dug yourself into a slight hole on this issue, and you're trying to get out of it, and now you're suggesting slightly mad theories.
Piers Morgan's completely right on this, and we know on this program we don't agree with him all the time, just probably 70% of the time or 60% of the time. Neil deGrasse Tyson says it isn't ridiculous to just say we should measure people by their hormone levels at the time. You know, that doesn't even work for men against men, because if somebody's on HGH and they grow to the size of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, how big he got, or Barry Bonds, how big he got, now all of a sudden their entire frame is bigger, their entire body is bigger, their skull grows. Now they're able to carry more muscle mass. That's already an advantage. And then if they go back down to the testosterone levels they were before, they are now still at an advantage. Same thing with steroids. People in fighting and MMA will go and they will take time off. They will do steroids to gain more muscle mass. Testosterone replacement therapy, get to back to where they were. and then come off of it. Now, there's an argument to be made for that versus human growth hormones, which physically makes you a larger person by stature. But it's already things that aren't allowed for male versus male competitions. And Neil deGrasse Tyson does things like, I used to wrestle back in the 70s or whenever it was. Obviously, this guy doesn't pay any attention to sports. And I'm not saying that as a dig. I'm saying he's dedicated his life to his trade, which is alleged sciences. And now he's like, I have the answer for sports. And he can say again that he's making it up now, but he hasn't. He's been saying this for months. And the idea that it's just down to a hormone test and people who are the same weight class is completely ridiculous. If you take a man who's 125 pounds in MMA, which is a flyweight, he can easily beat the biggest weight class of women, which at this point is 145 pounds. A 20-pound weight difference, the woman's going to lose pretty much every time. Maybe not against a random guy off the street of 125 pounds, but any professional 125-pound male fighter is going to more than likely beat any professional 145 female fighter. And that's why they don't do this. You can do it any way you want. It seems to me in sports, the equivalent to an adult woman versus a male athlete, it's right around 15 years old, 13, 14, 15. Why do I say that? Because we have several examples. We've had it in hockey. We've had it in soccer predominantly. We've had 14-year-olds, I believe, in both soccer and hockey go out and defeat professional women's teams, national teams as well. And I believe we've had it 15 and 16 and 17-year-old in soccer. So that appears to me to be the athletic equivalent. After a guy goes through puberty and, he plays lots of sports, he's usually better at the sport than the women are. You've got guys who are 17, 16 years old in high school that can dunk. Go watch any high school basketball highlights. As soon as you get to high school, kids are dunking. Some kids can dunk in grade 8. However, you can go to the WNBA, the highest level of professional women's basketball, and like 3 girls can dunk. So that's just a small example of the athleticism difference. And Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying, well, we could just hormone test everybody in the sport and do it that way to prove this wild claim that there's no unfair advantage for men to be in women's sports. The women can already play in men's sports, by the way. If a woman's good enough, she can come play in the man's sport. It almost never happens. It's never happened for longer than a bit. The only thing it's happened successfully in is racing, because there's not you're driving a car. But it's never going to happen in tennis. It's never going to happen in hockey. It happened in hockey for like a couple preseason games, and the girl got lit up, by the way. There was a Canadian women's hockey player in Division 3 hockey in Finland. That's about as high as it goes. So this idea that there isn't an advantage, and we need to go above and beyond to prove that there's no advantage is ridiculous. It's just men versus women. Let's see what else he tried to argue here.
Whereas the science to me is obvious. You've already given the best argument I've heard for why we separate the sexes.
Hold on. You misquoted me in this very interview. What I said was the idea of creating categories within a sport, splitting them in the example I gave, which I just made it up, like hormone ratios, is not fundamentally weird compared to dividing wrestlers by weight.
No,
because
it is.
The only
it
reason
is.
why you
I'm
do
going to
this
respond.
is to make an interesting contest.
No, Neil, you're wrong.
And so you said Floyd Mayweather fight. Hold on.
You're
you
wrong.
said Floyd Mayweather.
You're not allowing for
and
the superior male biology when it comes to lung capacity, stamina, to body mass, to muscle mass, all those things. If you just take one criteria of hormones, you're not allowing all that. I'll give an example. Caitlyn Jenner, who obviously... hang on. I'm going to finish my point. Let me finish my point. Caitlyn Jenner was a Olympic...
Before we end to Caitlyn Jenner here, which is Bruce Jenner, the idea that hormone tests and equal hormones between a man and a woman is this arbitrary weight class is ridiculous, because within male athletics, you might get a 145-pound man that can beat a 155-pound man. You might get a 205-pounder, a light heavyweight, who can beat a guy who's 230, a heavyweight. It could happen. 170 versus 185 is a big gap. 205 versus 225 is a bigger gap, but it's also at a higher rate. So 135 could probably beat a 155, maybe. There are some really thin and tall. What am I getting here? They're very thin and tall. I'm getting errors on my screen. MMA fighters who are 135 pounds, let's say, and they could still compete against a 155-pounder because they've got the length and the reach. That would happen rarely because the weight is such an advantage. However, there are no 135-pound women that could compete against even a 145-pound man or even a 135-pound man, the same weight class. So it's not as arbitrary. The weight class is not as arbitrary. The weight class is within the gender, and it's a huge advantage on its own. When you add gender in that, it's like a multiplier. You're adding this crazy advantage to the athlete. Now let's hear what he's got to say about Caitlyn Jenner.
Male decathlon gold medal winner. Caitlyn is a big golf fan. And when she started playing golf after she transitioned, she was allowed to play off the women's tees, which are 50 yards further than the men's tees. And she quickly realized that she was still smashing it 300 yards down, and obviously was then beating all the women that she played. So she now plays back off the male tees because her biology is that of a man. And I feel that that was the most honest way to deal with it. I also feel that if you want to have a separate category, have a trans category. Or have trans women compete against men, which is their biology. Isn't that the scientific way to resolve this?
I don't have a solution. What I started this section of the conversation by saying that how you handle trans athletes is a frontier in sports that does not yet have a full solution. And I made up an example, like maybe you could divide people by hormones. I don't know if that would work physiologically, but at the end of the day, we watch sporting events because they are competitively interesting. And so something's going to have to get resolved there, and I don't have that solution.
Okay, he doesn't have the solution now, even though he's argued for the same idea for months now. Completely cowardly argument, completely backs out of it once he's proven even slightly wrong, says, I don't even know. I'll just argue this point for months, but I don't even know. And obviously, my political alignments prevent me from admitting I'm wrong about this. Piers Morgan, on the other hand, saying Caitlyn Jenner is a male, but calling him a she. I don't know if that's because he's just in England or because he knows that Bruce Jenner can kick his ass. Aside from that, he brings up another point about having an all-trans league, and no one will watch this besides a couple random YouTube highlights because there's not even people watching women's leagues, and all you're going to get is men who can't compete in men's athletics who are now fighting each other dressed as women. It's going to be for perverts only to view. I don't know. It will do slightly better than like minor league sports, maybe, because there's the freakiness factor of it, but it's going to be slightly more competitive. Like, I don't even know, like, who are all these trans athletes? Is there enough of them? They wouldn't be trans. A guy who's good enough to play a professional sport wouldn't be trans. Like, you can throw Caitlyn Jenner, but this is 20 years or so, or however long, 25, 30 years after he competed in the Olympics, and then he had to live through the Kardashians and everything. That's a completely unique scenario. There aren't any professional level athletes who are trans. It's just not a thing. So they would be competing at a level that's much worse than top tier professional. And then people would watch it once and be like, that's crazy and weird. But at this point, I'm just watching men in drag or men with breast implants fight each other, and that's weird. And you'd stop watching. And it's the same reason there are no, women's soccer video games, women's hockey video games, and they have to piggyback onto the men's out of a charity. That's why the WNBA can't survive on its own. People don't actually want to watch these things. They'll watch it out of novelty. Maybe they'll watch the World Cup final for women or the Olympics for women, which is fine, but people are not consistently watching these things. People are not consistently watching them at the level that they watch the men's sport, and we have to hear people come out here and make excuses for it. And I know that's not what Piers is trying to do, but an all-trans league isn't going to work because there isn't an audience for it. There isn't an audience for a women's hockey video game because it's not going to work. But their argument will be, not Piers's, but other people's arguments will be, well, it's wonderful and it's so great that we wanted to include it. But it's so not wonderful and so not great that it can't sustain its own game, because if it could, you would make a separate video game for the WNBA and celebrate your two different verticals of profit here. But that never happens because it doesn't have the actual audience. So on one hand, we're kidding ourselves with this whole debate of people, let's make this trans league. But I understand that people are saying that because they probably know it would never work, and to keep the men out of the women's sports.
Turn it up, Jordan.